The word Blitzkrieg often conjures up images of daring panzer commanders leading their men from the turret of their panzer, smashing through hapless Allied soldiers as Stukas screech overhead and infantry bounce along behind in half-tracks. But these scenes are more myth than reality, formed by decades of propaganda. Much of this propaganda was written after the war by the panzer generals themselves. Manstein and Guderian were among the leaders of this movement. They sought to build an image of a glorious Wehrmacht that was only defeated by the obstinacy of the mad dictator Hitler. Of course, this self-centered imagery only made them look the better for having participated in the conquests of that dictator. Today we will be talking about the doctrine often referred to as Blitzkrieg. We're going to discuss the history of the term, who used it and when it was used. Then we're going to look into the real-world tactics of the Wehrmacht, taking time to compare them to those used by other nations. Then we will talk about how these tactics fared in real life, with notable examples from the Second World War. Finally, we will discuss how the propaganda of Blitzkrieg helped to cement the misunderstanding of the term we see today, and how it changed the outcome of the war itself. This series dives deep into complex and often sensitive historical topics that may not always align with YouTube's guidelines, so your support is essential. By becoming a member or patron, you're helping keep this project alive and ensuring we can continue delivering high-quality content to our viewers without worrying about demonetization. Our members and patrons have early access to the next 6 episodes. Become one by pressing the join button under the video or via the links in the description and pinned comment, and gain access to future Eastern Front videos and 200 other exclusive episodes. First, let's dive into what people are trying to describe when they use the word Blitzkrieg. The word is typically used to describe German military operations from 1939 to 1941. We are often told the hallmark of these operations was the speed at which they were conducted, hence the name Lightning War. Perhaps the best demonstration of this understanding was the 1940 Battle for France. In that campaign, the French and British were nearly knocked out of the war by an opening blow that lasted only a few days. The first phase of the Battle of France was a disaster, and very nearly resulted in the destruction of the BEF and the French army. However, it was not the end of the war. It wasn't even the end of the Battle for France. It is often glossed over that there was serious fighting in France for another 3 weeks after Dunkirk ended. So the Battle for France had ended quickly, 6 weeks or so. But the Schlieffen Plan of 1914 had reached its climax in front of Paris within 4 weeks. The unlikely rallying of the French army at the Marne was the difference. There was no attempt at a miracle at the Marne by the French army in 1940. That being said, the so-called Blitzkrieg had not succeeded in ending the war in one fell swoop. There were many causes of the French collapse, and the performance of her vaunted military was abysmal. In the aftermath, few people in the Allied world were willing to admit that France and Britain's shortcomings were responsible for a defeat that just weeks earlier had seemed impossible. It seemed easier to swallow that the Germans had developed something new, a special German way of war that had defeated the unsuspecting French and British armies. The truth was that the Germans had never planned for the war to go so well. Even the operational plan for the Battle of France had been born out of a realization that the strategic situation was hopeless. Invading France through the Low Countries was the only way to bring large forces to bear from the German side of the Rhine. The first drafts of the 1940 plan looked for all the world like they came from Schlieffen's desk in 1908. There was no alternative. The German General Staff had worked for years to understand the campaign of 1914, and could only conclude that there was little hope for something new and exciting. Only time, luck, and superior organization could overcome the Allies. The plan that was actually carried out in May of 1940 was the result of the Allies having lucked into a copy of the German plans. The General Staff and Hitler were made aware of the compromised plans, and after much debate, decided on a new plan authored in part by Manstein. It called for a thrust through the Ardennes and a drive to the sea in an effort to encircle and cut off the main Allied field armies in the Low Countries. This was a bold plan, but it was not original to Manstein. The idea had been tossed around in planning stages before and decided against. It was only the present need for a new plan to meet Hitler's timetable of an invasion of France as soon as possible that meant Manstein's ideas were accepted. It also conveniently placed his position at the center of the Wehrmacht's main effort. He was Chief of Staff to Rundstedt, who was commanding the army group responsible for this area. For our purposes, we need not get into a detailed history of the planning or the actual operations of the Battle of France. Suffice it to say that no one in the German planning organs conceived of the battle as a blitzkrieg. For them, the concept of a lightning war had existed, but as a strategic concept, not the operational doctrine envisioned by modern lay viewers when the word is used. German and specifically Prussian military thinkers had struggled with the strategic environment of the country since their defeat at the hands of Napoleon. The dilemma was that any war might be drawn into a long-term struggle that was beyond the abilities of the country to handle. They knew the weakness of the country and the precarious political situation on the continent. Since before the First World War, planning had also revolved around the need to avoid a two-front war. This was primarily to ensure that all of the country's resources could be concentrated on one front at a time, meaning that Germany could end the war as quickly as possible. By no means was Germany alone in developing strategies around the idea of keeping wars short. No one wanted a long war. Strategic planning, where the idea of a short war was actually formed, was not where Germany was doing something different. So now we understand that Blitzkrieg was not a doctrine of operations, and it was not a set of tactics. If it was anything to the Wehrmacht in 1940, it was an abstract concept that was tangentially related to an idea behind German strategic planning since 1870. If Blitzkrieg was not the reason for the Germans' stunning victory over France and Britain in 1940, what was? For one, a load of luck. Looking back at the campaign, Guderian wrote that it felt almost a miracle that they had succeeded. A series of honest mistakes by the Allies, combined with poor communication between the staffs of the BEF and French army, allowed the Germans the time they needed to move decisively. This was even more true after the breakout across the Meuse River. The Allies consistently stumbled in their response to the situation as the political situation in France deteriorated. There was confusion in Britain, as Churchill's government took charge from Chamberlain the same day the Germans started their invasion. The French changed army commanders at the climax of the campaign. There were arguments about British support in the field, while inadequate reserves were thrown piecemeal into the fighting. Incompetent commanders, poor coordination, and confused political leadership were all major players in the success of the German campaign. At the same time, all of it was unexpected. The Wehrmacht's generals were taken by surprise at the level of success they were experiencing. Hitler and others worried that the army was going to be stretched too thinly and be cut off by a counterattack. Only luck and the previously mentioned factors prevented them from suffering this fate. Tactics in the Second World War were fundamentally born out of their experiences in the First World War. This was true for every army in the world at this time. Every military came out of the First World War with a different understanding and lessons to be learned. However, there were a couple of common points. First, everyone knew armor, infantry, artillery, and reconnaissance elements needed to work together. Second, there was no argument by 1939 that planes would play a major role on the battlefield. The real question was how to make these elements work. Military planners and political leaders asked themselves not whether to use combined arms, but how best to do it. The French decided that their overall strategy must focus on fighting with combined arms teams in continuous defensive lines. To facilitate this, they chose to use infantry tank teams working at the speed of infantry. Speed was sacrificed necessarily at the altar of reliability, armor, and armaments. French tanks were the best in the world in 1940, outclassing every German model by a wide margin. Significant faults lay in the tactical conception of the continuous defensive lines. French leaders were not trained to use their units in aggressive independent attacks, because it would upset the lines controlled by the higher headquarters. Additionally, acquisition troubles meant that few tanks were equipped with radios. The British decided that supporting the French on the continent would mean a strong naval and air presence and limited ground support. To that end, the field army was small and better trained in colonial policing than in large combined arms maneuvers with Allied forces. They possessed several capable tank models, such as the Matilda. Still, the lack of large maneuver elements on the French side meant that the British also did not focus on this capability. The lessons the Germans took from the trenches of the Western War was that maneuver was king. They saw that it was the death of maneuver that had caused the First World War to degenerate into a brutal slugging match that killed millions. War without maneuver was an industrial exercise in killing that they couldn't keep up with. The British and French combined were the equal of the Germans, and when the Americans showed up, they had no hope of winning. Throughout that war, the Germans consistently outfought the Russians by maneuvering and carefully husbanding their limited resources. In the West, there was no chance for either. To this end, they dedicated the interwar period to understanding how to build their combined arms teams to accomplish this. The result was the Panzer Division and the later Panzer Corps and Panzer armies. These were built from the ground up to facilitate movement and independent action by local commanders. However, this was not the perfect distillation. Germany lacked the industrial base needed to mass equip its armies in this manner. Additionally, there was little clear direction from Hitler's confusing and competing bureaucratic hierarchies. The industrial base was constantly thrown from one priority to the next. This was done at the expense of stable production lines producing standardized equipment to fulfill a long-term acquisitions pipeline. So they resorted to having a few luxury divisions that would be mechanized to the peak, a few more infantry divisions that would be motorized with truck-drawn artillery, and the majority of the army would differ little from their ancestors. These last units carried everything they needed on their backs, with wagons drawn by horses following behind. The infantry of the Heer would move at the same speed as infantry from throughout history, about 5 kilometers per hour, no more, no less. This shortcoming would prove to haunt Germany on the Eastern Front, as the infantry could never consistently keep up with the panzer divisions. As a consequence, the panzers and motorized infantry were regularly forced to halt their advance, while the infantry trudged up to take their places, thereby freeing the mobile units for further advances. The doctrine that was developed is hard to pin down. In one interview after the war, General Schweppenberg claimed that there was no overall doctrine for the employment of panzer divisions in the German army during the war. This can be argued endlessly and has been on forums, in academic papers, and in cafes since the war ended. However, to give credence to Schweppenberg's claim is to reach across generational and cultural divides in an impossible manner. There is no way to ensure that we're working with a common understanding. No one bothered to ask him what he meant by his claim that there was no doctrine, and we cannot do so now. That man has been dead for over half a century, so we must work from common sense and the evidence that we have. First, what is doctrine? There are many answers, but if we must define doctrine, the United States Marine Corps uses a succinct wording. Doctrine is the fundamental principles, including tactics, techniques, procedures, by which forces guide their actions through training, education, and operations. This definition does not require a written document. Schweppenberg may have been right if he meant that there was no written document that laid down the principles of armored force employment. But there were certainly common understandings among panzer commanders about what their role was within the army, or else chaos would have reigned. Cooperative actions would have been impossible. What we know of actual panzer doctrine is easy to confirm from operational histories. The panzer divisions were considered self-contained mobile forces that were consistently assigned the task of breaking through enemy lines. After achieving this, they were given all manner of missions, but the most common seems to be the cutting of lines of communication, retreat, and logistics. During Operation Barbarossa, this was seen in the battles of Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. Large, independent panzer units were directed to drive through Soviet lines and link up behind the main body of the enemy. During this phase, infantry were to advance behind the panzers and secure their lines of communication. Once the encirclement was completed, then the reduction of the pocket would begin. This concept has been called the Kesselakt, or Cauldron Battle. It was built on the back of Field Marshal Schlieffen, head of the German army from 1891 to 1906. These battles involved infantry forces on all sides advancing into the pocket, reducing its size by their advance. Finally, the destruction of enemy forces would be achieved either in a final battle or the surrender of the troops within the pocket. Because of the aforementioned slow-going infantry, the panzers were forced to wait for relief. This meant that they were bogged down in heavy fighting that they were unsuited for. Once relieved or the pocket was eliminated, the panzers would drive on. These encirclement battles were designed to be accomplished on a massive scale, encircling entire field armies, and in the case of Minsk and Kiev, entire Soviet army groups. The scale of these battles was not set in stone. In fact, Hitler and his generals often found themselves butting heads on how aggressively the panzers should drive to encircle the enemy. Hitler was often nervous that the field armies were biting off more than they could chew, and consistently worked to convince his generals to go for smaller, more manageable encirclement battles. This can first be seen in France 1940, after he ordered a pause on the Panzer advance in order to allow the infantry to catch up and secure the lines of communication for Kleist's panzer group. It was seen again after the Battle of Minsk in 1941. After that battle, Hitler and Army Group Center's command, Field Marshal Bock, butted heads over the size of future encirclement attempts. Surprisingly, Hitler lost the argument, unable to effect his will on the old Field Marshal. Army Group Center continued to make large-scale encirclements, the last being at Smolensk in July of 1941. The emphasis on encirclement battles was not solely for the benefit of panzers and motorized units. All units were encouraged to seek an encirclement whenever possible. In 1933, Heer Field Service regulations called for artillery, infantry, armor and air to work together all the way down to the company level. This cooperation was to be facilitated in the first instance by personnel communication by the respective commanders. The regulations called for the artillery commanders to place their command posts as closely as possible to the infantry commanders. If personal communication could not be facilitated, then liaisons were to be assigned to the respective units. Finally, radio and telephones were to be used wherever possible. The placement of radio and telephones at the end may seem counterintuitive, but the Germans were well aware of just how easily telephone lines could be cut by enemy artillery fire. Radios were susceptible to jamming and eavesdropping. Sources do not mention this happening often on the Eastern Front, but the British and Americans in Africa made excellent use of these tactics. The imagery discussed in the opening of this episode is one that intentionally harkens to the propaganda of the Nazi regime, and the generals who, long after the war ended, continued to spread the ideal of the clean Wehrmacht. The romance of the advancing panzers was only part of this. However, these ideas did not only start after the war ended. They began as soon as the Germans had made it to Paris, conquering France, and culminating what they believed was the beginning of their ultimate victory. The propaganda machine of the Third Reich started churning out films, news stories, and radio broadcasts that portrayed the victory of the Wehrmacht in the West as the inevitable result of German superiority. These were shared far and wide inside of the army, as well as across conquered Europe. The effect began almost immediately, as German officers who should have known better started to believe their own propaganda. They believed in their operational brilliance, in the so-called Blitzkrieg. The collapse of the Low Countries, France, Poland, and the British Expeditionary Force made it easy to believe that they had truly created something unique and unparalleled in military history. The fact remained that they had not. The Wehrmacht of 1939 to 1940 had been able to capitalize on the unpreparedness of their enemy for a war of maneuver, and used the superior training and communication abilities of their tactical units to outflank the bewildered Allies. But it was not a unique ability that could not be replicated. As the Wehrmacht prepared for the invasion of the Soviet Union during the winter of 1940–41, the professionalism that had been a hallmark of German planning since the middle of the last century began to slip. Generals assumed the best-case scenarios for their maneuvers, and refused to take into account the obstacles that stood in front of them. These mistakes would reveal themselves within weeks of the start of Operation Barbarossa. It would not be long before the highest officers in the Wehrmacht began to doubt the outcome of the war. Many of them would lose all faith in their ability to win before the dawn of the next winter. This concludes our discussion for this week. Stay tuned, and remember, this is just the prelude to the weekly Eastern Front of World War II series. Don't forget to subscribe, comment, and share this video, it helps immensely. We have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member-exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.